You shouldn't be out here alone, a voice whispered through the rain, low and steady, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. The streets of downtown Chicago were empty at this hour, the wet pavement reflecting the harsh glow of the streetlights, and her sneakers slipped slightly on the slick asphalt as she hugged herself tighter, trying to keep warm. Tears mixed with raindrops, running down her cheeks, and she didn't even notice when her hands were shaking. She had just left the cafe where she worked 3 jobs to make rent, where her manager had scolded her for being late despite her exhaustion, and where the regulars were too busy with their own lives to notice the small, quivering figure of a girl barely keeping herself together. Emily ducked her head further under the hood of her jacket, wishing she could vanish entirely, when she sensed it before she saw it, a presence so commanding it made the hairs on her arms stand on end. From across the street, under the dim glow of a flickering neon sign, a man stepped out of a sleek black SUV, his long coat dripping rain, his posture rigid yet fluid, like he owned every shadow he moved through. She caught the flash of his dark eyes scanning the empty street, landing on her with a piercing intensity that felt almost tangible, as if he could see every fear, every insecurity she had tried to hide. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze, heart hammering in her chest, each beat a drum against the rhythm of the rain. He didn't approach quickly, didn't yell or make a scene. He simply observed, and in that observation, Emily felt a strange mixture of dread and safety. The rain plastered her hair to her face, and she wiped at her eyes, only to have more tears stream down, catching the light in tiny prisms, and that's when he moved. A single deliberate stride, boots hitting puddles with precision, closing the distance between them faster than she could calculate. She instinctively stepped back, but there was nowhere to go on the narrow sidewalk, nowhere to hide from the presence that felt almost supernatural in its control of the space. He stopped a mere 5 feet away, eyes never leaving hers, and finally spoke again. Soft but commanding. You shouldn't be out here like this. Her mouth opened then closed. Words failed her. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that she could handle herself, but the lie wouldn't come. She felt the warmth of his presence even through the rain, a strange reassurance that made her chest tighten. A sudden noise, a trash can tipping over down the alley, made her flinch, and he was there instantly, moving between her and the shadow, his hand reaching out to steady her, firm but not frightening. It's okay, he said quietly, almost a murmur, but Emily felt it like a promise etched into the air. The rain soaked her jacket, soaked her hair, but she didn't care. The world had narrowed to just this moment, just the stranger who had appeared from nowhere, powerful and calm. She noticed for the first time the sharp lines of his face, the dark sweep of his hair plastered to his forehead, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through her fear, and somewhere deep down, a tiny flicker of trust began to light. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He simply offered protection with a subtle nod, a slight shift in stance that silently communicated he would handle whatever shadows lurked nearby. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of exhaustion and despair pressing on her chest, but amidst it all, she felt a spark, a tentative thread connecting her to someone who could keep her safe, someone who could stand between her and the chaos of the night. The rain continued to fall, hammering against the streets and her shoulders, but she barely noticed. She noticed only the man, the quiet force of his presence, the unspoken promise in the way he held himself, and for the first time that night, Emily dared to breathe a little easier, the trembling in her hands softening just enough to wonder if perhaps she wasn't entirely alone after all. I should have walked away. Every sensible thought in my head told me to thank him, keep moving, and disappear into the night before I became involved in something I did not understand. But my feet refused to cooperate. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the cold that had settled deep into my bones. Or maybe it was the simple fact that for the first time in months someone had looked at me like I mattered. The stranger glanced toward the street before removing his coat and holding it out. Rainwater dripped from the dark fabric. Take it, he said. I stared at him. I am fine. The words sounded ridiculous the second they left my mouth. My soaked clothes clung to my skin. My teeth were practically chattering. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It was not quite a smile. No, you are not. Something about the calm certainty in his voice made arguing feel pointless. Slowly I accepted the coat. It was warm from his body heat, surprisingly heavy, and smelled faintly of cedarwood and expensive cologne. Wrapping it around myself felt like stepping into shelter after standing in a storm for hours. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded once as if gratitude was unnecessary. A pair of headlights appeared at the end of the block. A black sedan rolled smoothly toward us before stopping at the curb. Emily's stomach tightened immediately. The vehicle looked expensive. The kind of car that belonged to people whose lives existed on a completely different level from hers. The driver stepped out holding an umbrella and moved toward us with practiced efficiency. "Sir," he said respectfully. "Sir." The word caught my attention. The stranger did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on me. "You live nearby?" he asked. I hesitated. Every lesson about stranger danger echoed in my head. Yet something told me he was not asking for personal information. He was evaluating risk, looking for a solution. "About 6 blocks away," I answered carefully. His expression darkened slightly. He looked at the empty street, the closed storefronts, the rain, the late hour. Then he looked back at me. "You should not walk alone tonight." "I do it all the time." "Tonight is different." The answer came instantly. Firm. Final. The driver opened the rear passenger door of the sedan. I immediately took a step backward. The stranger noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. "No one is forcing you," he said quietly. "But I would sleep better knowing you got home safely." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A man I had met less than 10 minutes ago claiming he would worry about me. Yet somehow he sounded sincere. Completely sincere. Before I could answer, movement across the street caught his attention. His posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. His eyes sharpened. The atmosphere around him shifted. The easy calm disappeared, replaced by something focused and protective. He glanced toward a group of men lingering beneath a bus stop awning half a block away. They were doing nothing wrong, just standing there. But the stranger's attention lingered for an extra second before returning to me. "Get in the car, Emily." My breath caught. I had never told him my name. For a moment the world seemed to freeze. Rain continued falling around us. Traffic hissed through distant intersections. Yet all I could focus on was the fact that he knew exactly who I was. Seeing my reaction, he exhaled slowly. "Your employee badge is still clipped inside your jacket pocket." Embarrassment immediately replaced fear. Of course, I had forgotten all about it. The corner of his mouth lifted again. Definitely a smile this time. Small. Rare. Dangerous only because it made him seem unexpectedly human. "I am Ethan," he said. "And I promise you this, Emily." His voice dropped lower. Steadier. "Whatever made you cry tonight will not follow you home." For reasons I could not explain, I believed him. I wish I could say I climbed into the car because I trusted him. The truth was far less noble. I was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and too emotionally drained to argue with someone who seemed determined to keep me safe. The warm air hit my face the moment I slid into the back seat. My glasses fogged instantly and I pulled them off, wiping them with trembling fingers. Across from me, Ethan remained outside for another minute, speaking quietly with the driver beneath the umbrella. I could not hear the words, but I noticed something strange. The driver listened with complete attention. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he question anything. It was the kind of respect people gave to someone whose decisions carried weight. A few moments later, Ethan stepped into the vehicle beside me. The door closed, shutting out the storm. For the first time all night, silence settled around us. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that allowed me to finally breathe. "Address?" the driver asked. I gave it quietly. Ethan nodded once as if confirming information he had already expected. The car pulled away from the curb. Rain streaked across the windows in silver lines while downtown Chicago drifted past in blurred lights and reflections. I became painfully aware of how ridiculous I probably looked. Mascara smudged. Hair soaked. Eyes swollen from crying. I turned toward the window, hoping he would not notice. Of course he noticed. "You have had a difficult day." It was not a question. I laughed softly despite myself. That obvious? Only to someone paying attention. The answer caught me off guard. I stared at the city lights sliding past outside. Nobody had been paying attention lately. Not my manager. Not my landlord. Not the friends who had gradually stopped calling after I canceled plans too many times because I was working double shifts. Nobody. Yet somehow this stranger had noticed everything within minutes. I lost my second job today, I admitted before I could stop myself. The words escaped like air from a punctured tire. The cafe cut staff. I was late twice this month. Ethan remained quiet. Not the impatient silence of someone waiting to speak. The attentive silence of someone listening. And my landlord says if I cannot catch up on rent by next week. My voice faded. I hated how vulnerable I sounded. Hated how close I was to crying again. You do not have to explain. His voice was calm. Steady. You are carrying enough already. Something tightened painfully in my chest. The kindness nearly hurt more than the problems themselves. The driver turned onto a quieter residential street. My apartment building was only a few blocks away now. Relief should have filled me. Instead, an unexpected disappointment settled over me. The night was ending. The strange bubble of safety surrounding me was disappearing. Ethan glanced toward the passing buildings. Which one? I pointed toward the aging brick structure. Near the corner. The moment it came into view, his expression changed. Only slightly, but enough for me to notice. His eyes moved across the cracked entrance steps. The broken exterior light. The dark parking lot beside the building. He was assessing it. Evaluating it. The same way he had evaluated the street earlier. The car slowed to a stop. I reached for the door handle. Thank you, I said sincerely. For everything. Ethan looked at me for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted past my shoulder toward the apartment entrance. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emily, he said quietly, has that silver sedan been parked outside your building every night? My stomach dropped, because I already knew exactly which car he was talking about. My hand froze on the door handle. The silver sedan sat across the street beneath a flickering street lamp, half hidden behind the rain. Under normal circumstances it would have looked completely ordinary. Tonight it did not. Tonight, after everything that had happened, it felt different. My pulse quickened. How did you notice that? I asked quietly. Ethan continued watching the vehicle through the rain-streaked window. Because it is the only car on this block that has not moved in 3 hours. The answer sent a chill through me. 3 hours. He nodded. I saw it downtown earlier. For a moment I could not speak. I stared at the sedan again, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it belonged to someone visiting a friend. Maybe it belonged to a resident. Maybe I was letting my emotions run wild after a difficult day. Yet deep down, an uncomfortable feeling had already begun forming. The same feeling that had followed me home several times during the past 2 weeks. The feeling that someone was watching. Someone paying attention. Emily. Ethan's voice pulled me back. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? I swallowed hard. Maybe. His eyes shifted toward me. Waiting. Patient. I looked down at my hands. A few times after work I thought I saw the same car. Saying it out loud suddenly made it feel real. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Ethan remained silent. The driver remained silent. The atmosphere inside the vehicle changed. Not tense. Focused. As if everyone except me had already reached the same conclusion. Why did you not tell anyone? Ethan asked. I laughed softly. The sound came out sadder than I intended. Tell who? That answer seemed to affect him more than I expected. Something flashed briefly across his expression. Understanding. Maybe even regret. People should not have to face everything alone. The words settled heavily between us. For months I had been facing everything alone. Bills. Stress. Fear. Exhaustion. Every problem felt like another weight stacked onto my shoulders. And somehow this stranger understood that without me explaining it. A sudden movement near the apartment entrance caught my attention. The front door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside carrying grocery bags. The silver sedan immediately pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. My breath caught. Ethan noticed it too. The driver glanced into the side mirror. Interesting, he muttered. Ethan nodded once. Calm. Controlled. Like someone fitting together pieces of a puzzle. What does that mean? I asked. It means the driver was paying attention. My stomach tightened. To me. Ethan did not answer immediately. That silence told me more than words could have. Rain continued falling against the roof of the car. Somewhere down the block, a siren echoed faintly before disappearing into the night. Everything felt suddenly sharper. More real. Ethan finally turned toward me. You are not going inside alone tonight. I blinked. What? You heard me. His voice remained calm. Not demanding. Certain. I am not comfortable leaving you here until I understand what is happening. Every sensible instinct told me to refuse. Yet another part of me remembered the loneliness waiting upstairs. The empty apartment. The overdue bills on the kitchen table. The silent walls. For the first time in a very long time, someone was concerned about my safety. Someone had chosen to stay. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple business card. No title. No company logo. Just a name and a phone number. He handed it to me. Keep this. I stared at the card. Then at him. Who exactly are you? The faint smile returned. Small. Mysterious. Dangerous only because it revealed so little. Someone who does not like seeing good people afraid. And somehow, as I looked into his steady dark eyes, I realized that answer might be the most honest one he could have given. The car pulled smoothly into the dimly lit parking area behind my building. I hesitated at the door, glancing around at the empty lot, and the wet asphalt reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. Ethan did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone seemed to assert control over the small space, making it feel safer despite the darkness. I exhaled shakily and stepped out of the vehicle, the fabric of the coat still clinging damply to my skin. Ethan followed silently, closing the door behind us, his tall frame shielding me from the falling rain. I realized then how acutely aware he was of everything around him. Every shadow, every distant sound, the slight creak of a gate opening. Even the flutter of a loose newspaper blown by the wind caught his attention, and his eyes flicked toward it for just a second before returning to me. You do not need to walk alone, he said quietly, his voice low and measured, yet there was warmth in it that made me pause. I wanted to protest. I wanted to insist I was fine. But the night had stripped away any pretense. I nodded, my hands gripping the edges of the coat tighter. We moved slowly toward the entrance of my building. I could feel the way his presence buffered me, an invisible shield against every uncertainty that had followed me for weeks. Once inside the lobby, I noticed how clean it was, almost sterile compared to the harsh wet streets outside. Yet it felt suffocatingly quiet. Ethan did not release the space beside me. Instead, he adjusted slightly so that our shoulders nearly touched. I wanted to step away, but some part of me, the part that had been hollow and alone for so long, resisted. The elevator arrived with a soft chime and we entered. I pressed the button for the 4th floor. The smooth motion of the elevator did nothing to ease the tension coiling in my stomach. Ethan remained close, his gaze sweeping across the mirrored walls, catching my reflection as well, and for the first time, I saw myself as he might see me. Not broken, not helpless, but simply human, vulnerable, and deserving of protection. I could not look away from the subtle intensity in his eyes, the quiet command in his posture. When the doors opened onto my floor, we stepped out together. I felt exposed, yet safer than I had in days. I reached my apartment door and fumbled with my keys, my fingers numb from the cold and rain. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his coat brushing against mine. Inside, he murmured, and it was both instruction and reassurance. I turned the lock and pushed the door open. Warmth from inside washed over me, smelling faintly of old wood and worn carpet. I stepped in and shut the door, the weight of the outside world pressing behind it, yet somehow lighter now that he was here. Ethan remained just behind, his eyes scanning the small apartment, noting the details with careful precision. The mail piled on the counter, the damp shoes by the door, the water streaks on the floor. He did not comment, did not judge. Instead, he moved toward the window, checking the street below, and then finally allowed himself to relax slightly, his shoulders dropping from their taut position. I stood near the doorway, feeling the coat around me, feeling the presence beside me, and a strange comfort began to take root. For the first time in a long time, I believed someone was here to watch over me, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Ethan turned his gaze back toward me, and for a brief moment, The storm outside seemed a distant echo, the rain only a memory, the fear only a shadow. He nodded once, silently acknowledging the small victory of getting me inside safely. I allowed myself to exhale fully, and as the tension ebbed from my chest, I realized that for the first time tonight, I felt entirely seen and perhaps in some unspoken way entirely protected. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater struggling to push warmth into the corners of the room. I sank onto the worn couch, my coat still damp, and let my hands rest in my lap. Every muscle in my body ached from the rain and tension, yet there was an unfamiliar lightness lingering beneath the exhaustion. Ethan remained near the window, eyes scanning the street below, but I could sense that his focus had begun to shift. Not entirely, but enough to notice the slight relaxation in his shoulders, the ease that came from knowing that I was no longer standing alone in the storm. I dared a glance at him, taking in the sharp lines of his face softened slightly by the dim light inside. His dark eyes were steady, calculating, yet there was something warmer beneath the surface, a quiet assurance that nothing would reach me while he was here. My voice was barely above a whisper as I finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" The question lingered in the air, more rhetorical than needing an answer, yet I needed to hear him say something. Ethan turned his gaze toward me, expression unreadable for a moment before a faint tilt of his head suggested acknowledgement. "Because I can," he said simply. The words were deceptively plain, yet they carried weight, authority, and an unspoken promise. I wanted to ask more, to understand the depths of the care, the reason behind the vigilance, but I found myself unable to form another coherent thought. The silence stretched comfortably between us, a pause that allowed the world outside to fade into background noise. I noticed the faint sound of my own breathing, the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows, and for a fleeting moment, it was as if time itself had slowed. Ethan shifted slightly, approaching the couch, not closing the distance too quickly, just enough for his presence to be undeniably near. I felt the warmth of him in the space around me, an invisible shield that contrasted sharply with the chill that still clung to my damp clothing. "You do not need to face everything alone," he said quietly, his tone deliberate and unwavering. The words resonated within me, echoing the truth I had buried beneath months of late nights and constant pressure. I could not remember the last time someone had offered such assurance without expectation. I just did not want anyone to notice, I admitted softly, voice trembling. He nodded once, a subtle gesture that seemed to carry understanding rather than judgment. "Notice what?" I hesitated, unsure how to put into words the constant undercurrent of fear and fatigue that had followed me home every night, the quiet dread that had made ordinary streets feel unsafe. "Everything," I said finally. "The car outside, the feeling that I was being watched, the stress, the loneliness." Ethan remained silent, absorbing my confession, his expression neutral yet attentive. "Then let me worry," he said at last, and there was no coercion in his words, only resolve. I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. For the first time in days, I believed that someone else could carry part of the burden, that I did not have to stand alone. Ethan shifted back toward the window, scanning the street one last time before turning fully toward me. "Sleep soon," he said, almost a suggestion rather than a command. "Rest." The simple words carried an immense weight, and I found myself nodding, allowing myself to accept the small sanctuary he had created in my apartment. The rain continued outside, but it no longer seemed threatening. It had become background music to a night that, unexpectedly, offered comfort, protection, and a quiet hope that someone had truly seen me. The next morning felt unreal. Sunlight streamed through the blinds in pale golden lines, and for a few seconds I forgot everything about the storm, the fear, and the strange man who had stepped into my life without warning. Then I noticed the dark coat folded neatly across the chair near the window. The memory returned instantly. "Ethan." I sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from my eyes. For the first time in weeks I had slept through the night. No anxiesotes. No waking up every hour to check the locks. No staring at the ceiling calculating bills I could not pay. Just sleep. Real sleep. The realization alone felt like a miracle. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it, expecting another overdue payment reminder or a message from my landlord. Instead, there was a notification from my bank. I frowned and opened the application. My heart nearly stopped. The rent payment I had scheduled for next week was no longer overdue. The balance showed as paid in full. I stared at the screen, convinced I was reading it incorrectly. Then I checked again. And again. Paid. Completely paid. A cold sensation swept through me. Not fear. Confusion. I immediately called the management office. After several rings, a tired receptionist answered. "Your account," she repeated. I heard keyboard clicks. "Yes, Miss Dawson. Everything is current." "How?" I asked. I was behind. Another pause. More typing. "A payment was received this morning." My grip tightened around the phone. "From who?" "I am sorry. We do not disclose payment information." The call ended, leaving me frozen in the middle of my apartment. There was only one person who could have done something like that. Only one person who even knew about the problem. I looked toward the code again. My pulse quickened. No, could not be. Nobody helped people like that. Not strangers. Not in real life. Another notification appeared. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. "Good morning. Make sure you eat breakfast." I stared at the screen. My heart immediately recognized the sender before my mind did. Ethan. There was no greeting. No explanation. Just a simple instruction. Somehow it made me smile despite myself. Before I could decide whether to respond, another message arrived. "Also check your email." Confused, I opened my inbox. The first message nearly made me drop the phone. It was from the cafe manager who had let me go. The subject line read, "Employment opportunity." My breath caught as I opened it. The manager apologized for the previous decision. Budget adjustments had been made. My position was available immediately if I wished to return. I sank slowly onto the edge of the couch. None of this made sense. Rent. Job. The impossible timing. The impossible coincidence. My phone vibrated again. One final message. Sometimes people need a reminder that they matter. That was all. No signature. No explanation. Nothing. I looked around my small apartment. The unpaid bills were still there. The furniture was still old. My life was still complicated. Yet somehow, the crushing weight pressing on my chest had become lighter overnight. Outside, the storm clouds had finally disappeared. Sunlight reflected off the wet streets below. And for the first time in a very long time, hope felt less like a fantasy and more like something I could actually reach. For the next 3 days, I tried convincing myself that Ethan had simply been kind, generous, unusually observant. Nothing more. It was the only explanation that allowed my world to make sense. Yet every time I attempted to move on, something happened that reminded me of him. A text asking if I had eaten lunch. A short message reminding me to carry an umbrella before a sudden afternoon storm. Once, when my bus broke down on the way home from work, a black sedan appeared 15 minutes later, and a driver politely offered me a ride. The explanation was always simple, coincidental, reasonable, and yet none of it felt accidental. By Friday evening, I found myself staring at his business card again. The plain white card rested on my kitchen counter beside a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. No company name. No title. Just Ethan Carter and a phone number. I traced the edge of the card with my finger. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down. Unknown number. For a brief second, my heart raced before I realized it was him. "Are you working late tonight?" A smile appeared before I could stop it. "Yes. Double shift." A few seconds passed. Then another message arrived. "Then do not skip dinner again." I laughed softly. How he knew about my terrible habits remained a mystery. Before I could respond, another text appeared. "Look out the window." Confused, I walked toward the front of the cafe where I worked and glanced outside. Across the street stood a small flower stand I had passed 100 times without noticing. The owner, an elderly woman, waved enthusiastically the moment she saw me. Puzzled, I stepped outside. "Emily," she called. "These are for you." My eyes widened as she handed me a bouquet of white daisies. Simple, beautiful, fresh. There must be a mistake. She smiled knowingly. A gentleman already paid. Of course he had. I stared at the flowers while warmth spread through my chest. Daisies. Not expensive roses. Not extravagant arrangements designed to impress. Just daisies. My favorite flowers. A fact I had casually mentioned during a conversation 2 days earlier. The realization left me speechless. Back inside the cafe, I placed the bouquet near the register. Several coworkers immediately noticed. Questions followed. Smiles followed. For the first time in months, I found myself laughing with people instead of merely surviving another shift. Hours later, as I finished cleaning tables, the television mounted above the bar suddenly caught my attention. A local news segment was playing. Normally I ignored them. This time I froze. The reporter stood outside a downtown charity event discussing donations made to local housing programs and employment assistance funds. Behind the reporter, among a crowd of influential business leaders, stood a familiar figure. Ethan. He wore a dark suit perfectly tailored to his broad frame. Men and women twice his age seemed eager to shake his hand. City officials greeted him with obvious respect. Cameras followed his every movement. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The man who texted reminders about breakfast was apparently one of the most powerful people in Chicago. One of my coworkers noticed my expression. "You know who that is?" she asked. I slowly shook my head. "That is Ethan Carter." Her voice dropped slightly. "People say he can solve problems nobody else can." I looked back at the television. At the calm confidence in his posture. The quiet authority that seemed to pull everyone around him into orbit. Suddenly so many things made sense. The rent. The job. The way people listened when he spoke. The way he noticed everything. My phone vibrated again. One new message. "I hope the flowers made you smile." I looked from the screen to the television and back again. Then, for the first time since meeting him, I realized something that made my pulse quicken. Ethan Carter had entered my life like a storm. But somehow, without me noticing, he had become the safest part of it. The following week passed in a blur of long shifts, coffee cups, and unexpected moments that somehow always led back to Ethan. Yet the most surprising change was not in my circumstances. It was in me. For months I had been moving through life with my head down, focused only on surviving the next day. Now I found myself noticing things again. The way sunlight reflected off the Chicago River in the morning. The laughter of coworkers during lunch breaks. The simple comfort of walking home without constantly looking over my shoulder. It was as if someone had quietly adjusted the focus on a camera lens, bringing color back into a world that had slowly turned gray. On Friday evening, my phone buzzed just as I finished my shift. One message. "Meet me at Grant Park." Curiosity won immediately. 40 minutes later, I stood near Buckingham Fountain watching the city lights glow against the darkening sky. Families wandered along the pathways. Couples sat on benches. The air carried the scent of fresh grass and distant food carts. For the first time in years, I had nowhere else I needed to be. You came. I turned and found Ethan approaching from across the plaza. He looked different somehow. Still confident. Still composed. Yet there was less distance between us now. Less mystery. He stopped beside me and handed me a small paper cup. Hot chocolate. I stared at it before looking up at him. "You remembered." His eyes softened slightly. "You mentioned it once." The answer should not have surprised me. Ethan remembered everything. We walked slowly through the park, neither of us speaking for several minutes. Strangely, the silence felt natural, comfortable, like we had known each other far longer than a few days. Eventually I glanced at him. Why me? The question had been living in my head since the night we met. Out of everyone in this city, why did you stop? Ethan looked ahead for a moment before answering. Because I recognized something. What? He exhaled slowly. Someone caring too much and pretending they were fine. I looked away, suddenly unable to hold his gaze. The honesty in his answer hit harder than any grand speech could have. We reached a quiet overlook where the skyline stretched across the horizon like a sea of stars. Ethan rested his arms on the railing. Most people think strength means never needing help, he said quietly. It does not. The city lights reflected in the water below. I thought about the storm, the rent, the fear, the loneliness that had felt endless only a week earlier. Then I thought about the simple things Ethan had done. The messages, the flowers, the way he always seemed to appear exactly when I needed someone. You changed my life. The words escaped before I could stop them. Ethan turned toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then a faint smile appeared. Genuine. Warm. Rare. No, Emily. His voice was soft but certain. You changed it yourself. I just reminded you that you were worth saving. Emotion tightened my throat. The fountain lights burst to life behind us, illuminating the night in shades of gold and white. Around us, people continued walking, talking, laughing, completely unaware that my entire world had shifted. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that rainy night and how close I came to walking away. How easily our paths could have never crossed. Life rarely changes in dramatic moments. Sometimes it changes because one person decides to stop, notices someone hurting, and chooses kindness. And sometimes that single act becomes the beginning of everything.